for those of you who've been following the news, there is a big conference happening in New York. In fact, I just came back from that conference. It's the Summit for the Future. And this is a big initiative to reinvigorate multilateralism. And 143 world leaders are currently gathered in New York. And they've signed on to this very elaborate document called the Pact for the Future. And central to that document are questions of peace and security, all the conflicts happening around the world, questions of the ethical use of new technologies like artificial intelligence, generative AI, questions of global governance, making the global governance architecture more equitable with the reform of the UN Security Council, but also climate justice. How do we make climate transition, climate action more just? And so what I want to present to you today is a proposal for how to do that. And this is something I've shared at other forums. And the simple proposal here is that among the many tools that we already have at our disposal, the right to development could be one more tool for us to achieve climate justice. Why is climate justice important? Climate justice is important because without a sense of fairness and equity in the way that we manage loss and damages arising from climate action, we will not make progress in climate action. And we're increasingly hearing from various constituencies in the world, particularly in the global south, that the questions of climate justice have not been given the kind of attention that it should deserve in the climate action discourse. So for instance, at the various conference of parties, COP conferences on climate change, there's always a tendency to treat climate justice as a footnote item. You know, we have this long list of interventions on climate action, and by the way, it would be desirable to have climate justice. And so increasingly you hear from a lot of actors that it is important to have climate justice as part of the conversation. Did I lose the signal? Okay, so let me start with just a bit of a background. So these, what I'm going to speak about today is actually the outcome of a study for the UN that I'm conducting. Apart from my role as a professor of international human rights, I also currently chair the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development. This is a subsidiary body of the UN Human Rights Council, charged with the responsibility of providing expert advice to the United Nations on the right to development. And so we've been mandated by the United Nations Human Rights Council to prepare a study on climate justice and the right to development. So some of these ideas that I'm espousing today are ideas that we ultimately go into the report. So I welcome your feedback. You're kind of like my test audience for this. So if you tell me it doesn't make sense, maybe I have to go back and rewrite the whole document. So, like I said, the idea here is that the right to development is an important framework for climate justice. And to begin with, let me give you a very brief primer on the right to development. Some of you might be familiar with this, some not so much. So I'll just give you a very brief primer on what is the right to development. So the right to development is an international human right recognized under international human rights law. In 1986, the countries of the world came together to enact a document called the Declaration on the Right to Development, the UNDRD. But it was just a declaration. But in the past few years, there has been a move to make the declaration hard law. So it's not just a declaration. The declarations are not enforceable in international law. Hard laws are enforceable. So right now, in the General Assembly in New York, there's been a lot of deliberations in Geneva, but it's now moved to New York for a draft covenant on the right to development. Just like you have a draft covenant on economic and social and cultural rights, a draft covenant on civil and political rights. And the idea here is to make the principle of the right to development enshrined in international law, and that countries that have signed up to these covenants will be held accountable. It will be legally binding on these countries. So what I want to propose to you is how this covenant that's now been drafted might actually be very useful for working towards climate justice and ultimately achieving some kind of climate action. So the right to development really refers to the right of individuals to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development. So the emphasis here is on the ability of individuals and groups to be part of the process of development. Now, what is development? Development is defined in the document essentially in terms of well-being, the well-being of individuals and communities. It is an individual right, but it is also a collective right of peoples. So that's the interesting thing about the right to development agenda, both an individual and collective right. And the relevance of the right to development agenda is that it has been reinforced in several international human rights documents. And I've outlined some of them here: the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. And the 5 key principles that underline the right to development. It's about development that is human-centered, that development has to be centered on the human person. And the reason why there's this emphasis on the human person is because very often development tends to be measured in terms of indices, GDPs, and all these interesting economic indices, which are useful for economists and policy makers. But the right to development really emphasizes that the ultimate index of development is the human person. The second principle that the right to development agenda espouses is participation. Development must be participatory. In other words, the people must have a say in their development initiative. And you will know that this is a very key point, because so much of what happens in terms of government policies are framed with the language of development. You know, a road is being built, it's development, it's to develop the community. Infrastructure being built is to develop. Now, the right to development agenda says very clearly that the true process of development has to be participatory. The people to be affected must have a say in what constitutes a development initiative. The other principle of the right to development is self-determination. People must have a say in how their development process evolves. And to understand why self-determination is so central to the concept of the right to development, we need to understand where the right comes from. So the right to development actually emerged in the 1960s as an idea coming out of the countries of the global south that had just become independent from colonial rule, the G77 at the United Nations. And so they put forward what was called the New International Economic Order. And many of the leaders of Africa were very key to these initiatives, from Jomo Kenyatta here of Kenya, the leader, to Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, to Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. These leaders were crucial in framing the right to development. And they framed it as an international order, creating a new international economic order. that served not just the powerful interests in the global north, but also the emerging states in the global south. In fact, the draft, the original draft of the right to development was done by policymakers in Africa and in Latin America, trying to articulate a whole new agenda for what development means. And so in that context, self-determination was very important, that the resources of people as integral to development must be owned by the people. The self-determination has to be key in how we define development. And then finally, you have economic, social, and cultural development. So development is not just economic. Development also has social and cultural dimensions. A holistic approach to development. But I would argue that the most significant contribution of the right to development agenda, which I will speak about later on, is that it mandates international cooperation and solidarity. So international human rights tends to be very state-centered, very focused on the state. The state is the primary duty bearer for international human rights. If there's a violation, the state is held accountable. At the United Nations, states have to answer for violations within their country. And that is the established principle of international human rights law. And the right to development agenda also agrees with this principle of the state being the primary duty bearer for international human rights. But the right to development agenda goes even further. It recognizes that sometimes the factors that affect development are beyond the control of the state. So, the activities, for instance, of international financial institutions, whether it's the World Bank or the IMF, the activities of large international cooperation, sometimes these influences are beyond the control of any one particular state. So the right to development agenda, as espoused in the declaration, has a very interesting provision that you would find in few other human rights documents. It talks about the duty of states to cooperate to operationalize the right to development. So there is a domestic obligation of states, which is the standard obligation, but there's also, importantly, the international obligation to cooperate. And this is where I think it holds a lot of value for climate action. Because as we all know, climate change is not just an affair of one state. It is a global challenge. And here you have a declaration that states very clearly that the operationalization of development has to do with everyone working together to actualize it. So what I will now do, now that I've given you a sense of what the right to development agenda is about, is to speak to very specific aspects of this agenda that I think will help us in this movement towards the right to development. But first, I want to outline some of the points that I made earlier about how we construct development. And my favorite, I'm often asked when I make presentation on development, hey, professor, but what is development? Define development. And my favorite answer is these quotations from the Indian jurist and human rights expert, Arjun Segupta, where he says that the right to development, it's a right to the process of development. The nature of this process of development is centered around the concept of equity and justice, which the poor and the deprived having their living standards raised and the capacity to improve their position strengthened, leading to the improvement of well-being of the entire population. Notice that the word well-being has come up again, because well-being is crucial to how we understand development. The other quotation is also instructive, I think. concept of well-being in this context extends beyond conventional notions of economic growth, a point I earlier made, to include the expansion of opportunities and capacities to enjoy these opportunities captured in the indicators of social and human development, which in turn expands substantive freedoms. So that is another concept that features prominently in the Right to Development agenda. Substantive freedoms. Development is about choice. It's about freedom. And this is a freedom to think about what you want your well-being to look like. In some cases, it might mean a brand new bridge or new infrastructure or new roads. In some cases, it might mean the preservation of ecosystems, of retaining nature, and leaving the land undisturbed. And leaving the land undisturbed in that context, if desired by the people, it's development in itself. So we need to think, shift, a mind shift of what development really means. So the imperatives of climate justice. Why is climate justice so important? Why do we need to take it away from the footnotes and put it right at the center of the conversation? The important thing about the climate justice argument, and this is the point I make when I talk about climate justice, and I tell colleagues who are working in climate action, if you want consensus on a global question, if you want legitimacy for climate action interventions, then you have to center climate justice. Without climate justice, you will not find consensus. Without climate justice, you will not find legitimacy. And these two are critical for us to shift the needle on climate action. The other point I emphasize is that climate justice is not just a global South concern, because very often when I talk about climate justice, there's a tendency for people to think, oh, that's a developing world, global South issue. No, it's not. In fact, the first issues being raised in terms of climate justice came from the global North. The Just Transition Framework, coal miners in Poland, in the US state of Ohio, who were resisting windmills, resisting the shift away from fossil fuels in the United States and in Europe because they felt it would affect their jobs. And so they began the use of the language of just transition, that the language is transition is okay, but it has to be just for us. The government has to take care of us. Those of us who are coal miners who are going to lose our jobs. Those of us who work in the fossil fuel industry who are going to look at that. What about us? So the loss and damage arguments actually started in the global North. And then in the global South, these arguments continue. And the issue becomes, who bears the cost of curtailing fossil fuel development? So much of the Industrial Revolution in Europe and elsewhere in the world was really driven by fossil fuels. And fossil fuel, if you think about it in the short term, is still the cheapest form of energy. And so if we are now telling states in the global South that, well, this is not a good idea, and we all agree it's not a good idea, well, who's going to pay for the more expensive alternative? And so the point here really is that we need to think about climate justice as a global challenge, and one that is central to winning legitimacy and consensus on climate change. So the bottom line, ladies and gentlemen, is that the transition from fossil fuel-dependent economies to sustainable low-carbon economies will come at a cost. And maybe I should emphasize a short-term cost, because if we continue on this path, the cost will even be greater for the environment. So let's think short-term and long-term. So there will be long-term gains in that our environment will be cleaner and will replenish our planetary system. There's no doubt about that. But there's also no denying that there will be immediate costs now. And the question is who pays for that? And the global justice framework simply says that that process has to be fair and it has to be equitable. And so what we're saying with this framework is that the current, and there are many current initiatives that address the question of climate justice, from the Green Climate Fund to climate adaptation and resilience initiatives to loss and damage mechanisms. And all of these are very important frameworks, and they've done some good. The carbon credit systems, even though it has its limitations here and there. But the argument here, this is the argument we make for the right to development, is that given the scale and the scope and the uneven impact of climate mitigation strategies, these initiatives have not been sufficient in addressing the critical issues of climate justice. We need more. And that more is the right to development. So we're not saying that, what we're saying in this report is not that these initiatives haven't been helpful. They have. What we're saying is, here is one more tool, here is one more mechanism in your arsenal that the international community can use to achieve climate justice. So in the next few slides, because I'm really interested in hearing from you and engaging in a conversation about this, I want to talk about the possibilities. So I'm saying that climate, the right to development, provides an additional tool in our toolbox for climate justice, which is essential to achieve sustainable climate action. See the connection? So what I'm trying to do now is to emphasize, and I hope there are some legal or law students in the audience who can test out some of these ideas. The draft convention. So like I said before, we're moving the right to development from soft law to hard law. So there's going to be a covenant on the right to development. And what I'm going to talk about here are some of the specific provisions of this new covenant that I think are going to be very useful moving forward. And I have to say, it's not yet been adopted by the UN. As you can imagine, with all covenants, there's going to be intense debate. There's been intense debate over this covenant for the past 10 years. And it's only just now at the final stage. And I imagine there's going to be more debate among states. But here are the key elements of the covenant. So the first one is the right to regulate. It provides very explicitly that state parties have a right to regulate on behalf of their peoples and to take regulatory or other measures to achieve sustainable development within their territories. So here is a provision that asserts state sovereignty, that state parties will have the authority to negotiate on behalf of their people. And this is a very interesting legal concept, because what we're talking about here are derivative rights of states. So states have rights to negotiate on behalf of their people. States in themselves do not have human rights. But in the conception of this covenant, states may have derivative rights to negotiate for their people. And a good example that comes to mind is the recent COVID pandemic, where the states really became, governments became really at the forefront of negotiating for vaccines, scarce vaccine in the international community for their people. The other point that the draft covenant stresses that I think is relevant for climate justice and therefore climate action is again the right to self-determination. This right that I've talked about that is so central to the right to development agenda. All peoples may in pursuit of the realization of the right to development, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources based upon the principle of mutual benefit and international law. In no case may people be deprived of its own means of subsistence. So people must have a right to their subsistence. And then, significantly, you recall I talked about the international dimensions of this right. There is the obligation of international organizations in Article 9. And this is born out of the realization that certain questions relating to development go beyond the state. And so there is an obligation here for international organizations. They have an obligation under this covenant. So we're really seeing a shift in the way we think about human rights with this covenant. That the obligation and the duty bearer is not just the state. It is also the international organizations. And there's a whole debate within the UN system about business and human rights. So huge companies working around the world, some of whom have more resources than entire states. What is their obligation to human rights? And so there's actually a talk now about the draft covenant on business and human rights. A few more points about this covenant that I think will be helpful. The first is special remedial measures. That there will be special remedial measures for certain regions and countries that are susceptible and are vulnerable to climate change, owing to marginalization, vulnerability, indigeneity, or minority status. So in some ways, the covenant recognizes that certain communities are more vulnerable than others. And that's really what we want to address with climate change and climate justice, with the loss and damages framework, that certain communities who have contributed less to the climate crisis are bearing the brunt of climate change. And therefore, remediation and mitigation measures must account for these disparities. And this is a language that I think is beautifully outlined in this covenant. The other point that I think is also important from a perspective of climate justice is the emphasis on vulnerable states. Reflections on historical injustices, conflict, environmental hazard, climate change, and other disadvantages may require special remedial measures. So there's a provision that says that because of the realities, and I think historical injustices is very important here, because that is what we hear very often in the debate about climate justice, that there is a need to pay more attention to this. And then indigenous and tribal people. Of course, indigenous people are always at the forefront of the challenges of climate change. And yet they hold so much knowledge that remains untapped in how to deal with climate change. And I'll be talking more about this in my talk tomorrow, harnessing indigenous deliberative systems for climate action. But there's a recognition of indigenous and tribal peoples who have a right to pursue their own economic, social, and cultural development. And we can apply these principles directly to climate action and questions of climate justice. So to conclude, what are the possibilities for this draft covenant for climate action? Very often, human rights instruments are criticized for just being documents. They are written in Geneva and New York, and they have no impact on the lives of peoples. In fact, one of the criticisms of the Pact for the Future that has just been signed in New York is that it's a long list of desirable, and there are people who are worried it won't do anything. There's conflict raging in the Middle East, in Sudan, in Ukraine, and you have this beautiful document that talks about our agenda for a more peaceful future, outlines some very concrete steps on how these concepts of development can be operationalized, actualized. So one of them is impact assessment, a mechanism for impact assessment, for holding states accountable. So states, when they sign up for this covenant, are basically saying, we agree to be assessed periodically. And there's already a system within the United Nations called the Universal Periodic Review, where states submit themselves to peer review by other states and experts on how well they've actually followed up on their commitments to this covenant. The other one is the periodic review system that's followed by a conference of state parties that shall be engaged in regular review, system that will hopefully hold states accountable for their obligations. And finally, the establishment of an implementation mechanisms. So once we finally have this covenant and states have signed up to them, there is going to be established a mechanism that states will be expected to follow and submit themselves to ensure that there's compliance with the provisions of the convention. So in some ways, the convention anticipates that so many of the ideals espoused in this document might be difficult to actualize. And this is one of the interesting things about the right to development. It is a resource-intensive right. You know, what we say in law is a positive right. It is not a negative right. A negative right is not resource-intensive. You know, the freedom of expression. The government does not have to spend money to give you your freedom of expression. All it needs to do is get out of your way and allow you to speak. The freedom of the press, the freedom of religion. These are negative rights. But when we start talking about the right to development, we're really thinking about positive rights, resource rights, expensive rights, where the state has to invest money, education, healthcare, climate action. And so there's always this concern that when you begin to prescribe positive resource-intensive rights, states will back up and say, well, they're nice to have, but we don't have the money. And so the convention has a principle called the principle of progressive realization. So yes, we know you don't have the money to check all these boxes right now, no one does, but you have to show that as the money comes in, you're addressing these issues that you've committed to. So here is the final summation of my thesis this afternoon, is that the right to development is a tool, one that we haven't used quite well in the past for climate action and climate justice, but that now that we are almost at the cusp of a legally binding covenant, we should think more seriously of using this new mechanism to further the goals of climate action and climate justice.
My question has always been, when the global north is saying that the global south has to comply to these things called climate change, for sure it's a good thing and it's a global thing. What will we do? What will it take us for us to reach that level of development? Another thing is I've realized is a lot of conventions that are in place that are being signed, but there's lack of the political will. How are we supposed to address? As academics, we can talk all these things, but what happens when we don't have the political wills in our countries? For instance, the United States and the big five, they have been known for the longest time to be advocating for these things. In US, around 1972, they had the power to actually be part of the global change and climate change, but they walked out. So what would make us to actually take part and agree and do something? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You raised an important question that I started with. Trust. trust. Without trust and legitimacy, we will go nowhere with climate action. And that trust has to be addressed in the discourse on climate justice. So when people in the Global South say, one, why are we bearing the costs disproportionately for all this climate intervention? You know, as someone put it to me, he said, and this is a local person in one of our focus groups in Ghana, and he said, and he put it very succinctly. He said the West had their industrial revolution maybe 100 years ago, and it was founded on fossil fuel. And every single resource available was used to engineer that industrial revolution. Even children could work. If you go and you read the history of industrial England, you will know that there were no children's rights legislation, so children could work in the factories. There were no labor rights legislation, so everyone could work. The whole of society, the whole of the resources, this is the context of imperialism, was mobilized to industrialize those societies. And then you have, this is our own industrial revolution, that we're being asked to industrialize with two hands tied behind our backs. And I think it really succinctly captures some of the angst and frustration. So who pays for this? And this is why climate justice has to be front and center of the conversation. That yes, there's a recognition that those who contributed to these crises the most have to pay more. But that the Global South also has to recognize that it is in their interest that they take a different development path. And that the old path that might have worked 100 years ago is not sustainable even from an enlightened self-interest perspective. So we can't continue to burn fossil fuels in our own environment. And so that is the basis for the conversation. That if we center climate justice and we acknowledge these disparities, then we can begin to move forward as a global community. We are all in this together. You know, the climate crisis is affecting everyone. It's like the pandemic, you know, the virus, you know, it doesn't know any borders. So we have to face them together. The second quick question, political will is crucial. Without political will, there will be no action. And one of the things that I always say is, these covenant, it's going to be signed by states. So when it is signed in New York, you have heads of states come in and there'll be a elaborate ceremony to sign them. But you know who will use them? Civil society, NGOs, local communities. They will have this tool to hold their states accountable. And that's how human rights has always been. That it often doesn't rely on the goodwill or the goodness of heart of those who sign this document. Rather, what it provides is for law students like you, in your clinics, your legal clinics, for legal practitioners, for NGOs, for community groups, to go to the courts, to go to the African court, to go to the international courts, and say, these are obligations that our leaders signed up to, that the international community signed up to. We want them to be enforced. And we have cases, the jurisprudence of the African court, for instance, has several cases. In fact, the African court jurisprudence has been the most progressive in using the right to development as a framework for enforcing the rights of indigenous people. The Endorois case, for instance, you might be familiar with. It's founded on the right to development. And there are many cases before the International Human Rights Commission where these cases are coming forward and people are drawing on them. So I say, don't throw away the baby with the bathwater. There is a justification in being skeptical. But if we look at the history of how human rights has evolved, we know some good comes out of it. They provide a tool for us to make our leaders accountable. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Michele Poletto. I work with the International IDEA, the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance.
Yeah.
And we are very happy to have you also tomorrow for another event here in Nairobi. My comment is, actually related to your first question, your first answer. You mentioned the importance of climate justice, its relationship with energy transition,
Yes.
and the differences between the global north and the global south, as you also mentioned before. And while in the global north, for example, in Europe now, there's no open refusal of the need to act on climate change. The debate is a little bit more nuanced.
Yeah.
So some political parties try to delay the transition, but there's no open opposition to energy transition anymore in Europe. As far as I know, in some parts of the global south, in Africa as well, sometimes it's very difficult to talk about energy transition as such. If you discuss with Nigeria, for example, or Angola, it's almost a non-starter.
Yes.
So it was really interesting to listen about the right to development as a tool for climate justice. And it's clear, absolutely clear, how this can complement the debate around adaptation or loss and damage. My question is, can we use the idea of right to development to advocate also for mitigation efforts?
Yes.
Because when we, as you just said before, when we consider not only the short term, the next 10 years, but we look at the next 20, 30 years, energy infrastructure, energy markets are very long processes to develop and to manage. So it is in the interest of also African countries to have a different path. So can we try to table the discussion with, for example, these kind of countries in these terms? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's interesting you mentioned the reluctance to have any conversation on energy transition in some parts of Africa. I was recently in Nigeria, where you might know that Dangote, one of the richest people in Africa, just built a $20 billion refinery by the beach, by one of the nicest beaches in Lagos. And so here I was trying to convince these people who've just built this multi-billion-dollar refinery, on the beach that's going to produce all this fossil fuel. And this is celebrated, and I can understand why, as great development. But you have to think about the long term. It was like pouring water on stone, nobody cared. We want this development right now. But I agree with you. We have to frame it in terms of the long-term gains. And so climate mitigation, the right to development, becomes a tool for making the case for climate mitigation strategies. So one of the points that have come out of the discussion on the Pact for the Future, it goes back to the point you made. In the 1970s, if Americans had signed up to this, maybe we won't be here. But at the United Nations, I can tell you what's happening now. The question is, if in 1945 or 44, when we established the United Nations after the end of the Second World War, we had thought about the future, perhaps we wouldn't be where we are now. But we were not thinking about the future. We had just come out of a devastating Second World War. We were interested about the here and now. Peace, security, the future be damned. Now we recognize, gosh, we should have been thinking about the future. We should have been thinking about the future generations. We should have been thinking about the planetary system. And so what's happening in New York this week is just an attempt to say, hey, all of the things we've been thinking about shouldn't just end now. We should be projecting into the future. What are the challenges we do not see now that are likely to happen in the future? Because human rights are not just for the rights for the people living today, you and I, it's the rights of future generations. But they're not here to speak for themselves. So we have to speak for them. We are only here for a while, and we are at best custodians of this planetary system for a while. We can't run it dry. And so the idea here is to begin to frame whatever interventions and mitigation strategies in the long term. What does this mean for future generations? What does this mean for the healthy planet? So for countries in the global south, that is how you frame it. What does a different path to development mean for your own long-term future? Because people have to see their own interests in the debate. And one way of making those who are skeptical, particularly in the global south, see their interest in the debate is to really help emphasize the right to development. And I would add now the pact of the future, the long-term perspectives it takes to development and how that can now influence mitigation strategy. And of course, like I said before, the fact that international organizations are also integral to this process. It doesn't just say, hey, states, you have to do this. It's all hands on deck. That is something that when we were negotiating this covenant, that is something we had a lot of. Don't leave it to just states. You have to get the international organizations involved. And hopefully now that the covenant acknowledges that and has obligations on international organizations, we might begin to be able to make a better case for mitigation strategies. When I talked about costs, I tended to emphasize the financial costs. But what I didn't emphasize, which is also a cost, is what we give up. That's also a cost. And I used to have 2 cars, but now I have to ride a bicycle. That's a cost. Now, it's been established that our planet cannot sustain this level of consumerism. So if you think about the levels of consumerism in North America, for instance, if we all the communities in the world, you think about Africa, Latin America, Asia, if we all aspire to that same level of development, a 2-car garage in most homes, 3 TVs in most homes, central air conditioning in most homes, 3 cars for each home. If we all subscribe to that level of development, our planet cannot sustain it. So costs of climate change is not just who is losing and needs to be compensated or mitigated, but also those who are costing the planet so much. What interventions are they making to reduce the cost? And this is, for instance, my critique of the current carbon credit system, because it gives the impression that certain parts of the world, the West, can continue to live the way they've always lived, as long as they make enough profits to ensure that the global South does not aspire to that same level of consumerism. So I know this is simplistic, but that's how I see it. So the big companies can say, hey, well, we're buying carbon credits from Kenya, so we can continue. We're giving Kenya X amount, millions of dollars as carbon credits, and we can continue doing business as usual, after all. And that's not the point. The point is that the costs in terms of real impact on lifestyle has to be evenly distributed. If you have a carbon credit regime that reinforces the mentality that you can continue business as usual as long as you're buying carbon credits for pittance anyway, in the Amazon, in Brazil, in Kenya, in Tanzania, things are fine, then that's not a sustainable model. Because 1, it doesn't address the question of justice, and 2, it doesn't address the question of legitimacy. So those are the 2 principles. Those of you who are law students will know of this maxim. It is not enough that justice is done. Justice must be seen to have been done. So the perception of justice is as important as the substance of justice. So when those in the global South are saying, yes, we're getting carbon credits, but hey, see those guys are living, nothing has changed. Then you have questions of legitimacy, and then you have questions of credibility, and then you have questions of justice. And that undermines. And so the work that remains to be done is to show that we are all bearing the costs equally. Not just in who's paying, but what we're giving up. You know, for those of you, I understand that this is it's a Catholic university, is it? Okay. So those of you who are Catholics, as I am, will know about the concept of penance. What you give up at a critical time, you probably can afford it, but there's a sense that at this critical time, you give up something. So I think the philosophy of penance is what we need for the world right now, that we've made all these horrible mistakes. You know, we've kind of sucked our planet dry. We have all these issues. Now, we all have to pay penance, some a bit more than others. But it has to be collective. And that's how we eventually make that change happen. And the right to development, I think, does that because it addresses it from a global perspective. And it recognizes, you know, I talked about the aspects of the convention that talks about mitigation strategies. And there's a line there that talks about historical injustices. That's something you typically not find in an international legal instrument, which tend to be forward-looking. But this recognizes that. It talks about indigenous people. It talks about vulnerable communities. So there's a recognition of the inherent inequities in the global political economy and that the efforts to address climate action has to take care of all of this if we must make progress. Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Prof, for the very insightful lecture. I really enjoyed it. I think I've learned a lot. So I'm Dominic Kemei, work here, but also do masters, sustainable energy transitions here. So my question is, so on the electric vehicles, so we know countries like Norway, they have very high adoption for electric vehicles. You know, they have very nice subsidies for electric vehicles. But then, you know, much of their finances, almost half in 2019, of their external revenues was from oil, if I'm not wrong, which has allowed them to be able to afford these EVs. Yes. Same case to China. You know, China, BYD is, I think, the largest producer of electric vehicles, even bigger than Tesla. But it's because of the amount of the energy and, of course, resources and everything that China has that are able to have such scale of, you know, such huge scale of economies of scale to be able to make these things cheaper. So in short, these fossil fuels and everything is what has made these countries to afford to transition to the new state that they are currently in. So how do you make the same balance for these other countries, like Africa, for instance, Mozambique, which has a lot of oil and gas reserves? Someone says it's almost the same as Qatar. I'm not sure, these are just rumors. So how do you convince them not to use them, to allow them to be able to afford that which Norway and China has? Because I kind of feel like if these people are suppressed from harnessing these resources, then the rich people would, you know, China, you know, they can easily transition their economy to start building electric vehicles and sustain their economy because people will be employed in the new industries. But, you know, a country that has not harnessed those resources do not even have that resource to transition. So how do you get that balance right?
Yeah.
Or is it possible to maybe say, okay, you can harness your resources to this level, as long as you don't kind of like reach this limit, you know, kind of what's the 2-degree pathway, you know, where people are saying, let's not reach this limit. Are those some of the tools that can be used to bridge that gap?
Very good question, Dominic. Dominic, right? So Dominic, I want to ask you a question. I'll push this back a bit to you. So the example you just gave is really interesting of China and Norway and the transition and what makes it possible to have the transition. So if I asked you, Dominic, and I said, from a global perspective, what's happening in those contexts as you described it? Is it real transition? Would you call that a real transition when you look at the global picture?
Real transition from?
Yeah, because the idea is to transition from fossil fuel to renewable energies. But you've just explained how what's making the seeming transition happen is because of an intensification of renewables somewhere else. In other words, it's still happening, it's just not happening in this space. So I say, when you look at all of this, would you still say, speaking aggregately, globally, would you still consider a transition?
Not really, but also it is what allows that scale. Just to even add something, China is the largest producer of solar panels
Yes.
in the world. Like, the likes of Jinko, the likes of JA Solar, all of them are mostly in China. But you see, that is what has allowed them to be able to harness such economies of scale to make these transitionary, the things that will be used in the transition, to be cheap enough for people to be able to adopt. So it's both a solution, but still not a solution.
Problem. So what you've touched on here, Dominic, it's an interesting one that more and more people are asking us to do. Define what is real transition. So you can take something from here, from one hand, and put it in this hand, and say, see, I have nothing, I've done away with it, but it's just showing up somewhere else. So on an aggregate in the world, the transition isn't as significant as it shows. The other example I can give you is this whole question of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles use a lot of batteries, huge batteries, and these batteries don't come from the air, they have to be mined. Cobalt has to be mined in the Congo. And disposing of these depleted batteries is a very labor and resource intensive process. So yes, there are brand new Teslas in the streets of California and Silicon Valley and Canada and US. But anyone who's followed what's happening with cobalt mining in the Congo, and not just the environmental impact of that process, but also how it seems to be fueling conflict and intensifies in low intensity. We have to think about costs more elaborately. So you've just introduced to me now a new dimension of the costs. So when I sit down, I'm thinking about costs and damages. I'm going to include what you just said. What is the cost to mine the materials for these renewables? What is the cost politically for a fragile society like Congo? What's the cost socially for the fractured relationship arising from the conflict arising? So it's a very complex and nuanced process. And this is why the cost and damages debate has to go beyond just numbers, 5 million, 3 million GDP. We have to think about the real cost of the transition. And to answer your question, the solution, once we know the real costs, before we decide how to share, profit, we have to know what the total package is. We can't share without knowing. So the first thing is a comprehensive assessment of the costs and the damages. So we know that, we analyze that, we get experts to sit down and really analyze it. Okay, now we have a sense of the full ramification of the cost of transition. How do we share the cost of that transition? And some of it is carbon credits, which you hear a lot about, but some of it might be mitigation plans that allow certain countries to continue using fossil fuels for a particular period. I know it's not a popular idea in climate action circles, but it's the reality that there has to be a way to think about how to create stability and fairness in those societies. But the first thing we need to do, and this is what we push for in the Right to Development agenda, it's a full recognition of the costs and damages, of the scope of the costs and damages of climate transition. Right now, we think that the assessment of costs and damage is simplistic, does not account, focus mainly on numbers and economics, does not account for political, social, cultural costs, and that a full conversation on mitigation strategies must address the broad spectrum of economic, social, political costs of climate action, and then a sustained and reasoned conversation on how to equitably share the costs of climate transition. I thank you for listening.